The key drivers of civilizational contraction, ineffective leadership, resentment of imperial rule, and climate change reoccurred time and time again over the course of the early history of civilization. Imperial leaders struggled to find ways to maintain effective control over vast regions, and large populations of often restive peoples demanded freedom and self-rule, often during times of environmental stress. In Mesopotamia, after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, order was eventually restored by the Lugals of one of the newly independent cities, the ancient city of Ur, who re-established centralized administration in Sumer and in Sargon's old homeland of Akkad to the north. During the so-called Neo-Sumerian period, the status of the Lugals was further enhanced by the memory of the success of Sargon, Akkad's first imperial ruler, in that the reigning Lugal was now regarded not just as a semi-divine leader, but as an actual living god. With the divine Lugal in power in Ur, the other city-states became part of a confederacy under the leadership of that Lugal, and were directly administered by governors appointed by the authorities in Ur. This arrangement lasted for the next 150 years, but sometime around 2000 BCE, invasions by Elamite peoples effectively destroyed the power of the Sumerian Lugals and ended this chapter of Sumerian self-government. The Elamites came from the high country to the east of Sumeria, in what is today southwestern Iran. Their culture was destined to have a major influence on the great Achaemenid Persian Empire that would emerge 1500 years later. Following the Elamite invasion, the formerly orderly society of the Sumerians was fragmented and chaotic for almost the next 2 centuries. Some local city rulers were able to hold on to their power and pass sometimes impressive pieces of social legislation, but there were also periods of ineffective government in all the cities of the region. Although defeated militarily and politically by the Elamites, however, the sophisticated cultural achievements of the Sumerians were destined to powerfully influence all subsequent civilizations that established themselves in the region. In the early 18th century BCE, a group of Semitic-speaking Amorites gained power in the city of Babylon, restoring order and paving the way for the reign of one of the most extraordinary rulers in all world history, King Hammurabi. Hammurabi ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE, and during that period of more than 2 decades, his political and military power expanded until he had built a substantial empire that would last until about 1600 BCE, and that included most of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi, who called himself King of the 4 quarters of the world, maintained his empire in part by promulgating one of the first written law codes in human history, a law code that has proved enormously influential. As an imperial ruler, Hammurabi was aware of and able to learn from his imperial predecessors. For example, he improved Sargon's administrative techniques by establishing a centralized bureaucracy and a regular system of taxation. The king and his bureaucracy ruled from the capital city of Babylon, unlike Sargon, who had been forced to continuously move around all the various cities of his realm to suppress potential revolts. Instead, Hammurabi stationed deputies in the provincial city-states to act as his governors. Learning from some of the mistakes of Sargon, instead of imposing ruinous tributary taxes on the cities and peoples of his realm, Hammurabi collected more reasonable tributes more regularly. Through all these measures, Hammurabi established an imperial administration that was more efficient and more predictable. And by spreading the cost of government more evenly, he engendered less resentment and achieved much greater stability in his empire, a situation that subsequent imperial rulers attempted to emulate. Despite his reputation as a very able administrator, King Hammurabi is most famous for his code of 300 laws, which he claimed in a prologue were aimed at protecting the poor from exploitation by the wealthy. Clearly, Hammurabi borrowed liberally from earlier Sumerian precedents in codifying these laws. So these are not actually the first laws we are aware of in world history. That honour belongs to the Code of Ur-Nammu, written some 4 centuries earlier. But the Code of Hammurabi is undoubtedly the most systematic, comprehensive and influential of all the codes produced in Mesopotamia during the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, and their promulgation marks the crossing of another threshold in political administration. Hammurabi's claim that the laws were intended to prevent exploitation of the weak by the strong has led historians to wonder whether the earlier Sumerian models, promulgated perhaps by 2500 BCE, might also have had a similar aim. If the claim is genuine, then conceivably the first laws produced by our species were seriously intended to protect the weak from the strong, the poor from the wealthy. In any case, King Hammurabi explicitly stated in the prologue to his code that the gods had chosen him to, quote, promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil so that the strong might not oppress the weak, to rise like the sun over the people and to light up the land. The actual laws themselves, however, are ambiguous on this question. Certainly there are strong claims for equal treatment under the law, with demands for an eye for an eye or a broken bone for a broken bone. But at the same time, the punishments differ considerably depending on the class or status of those involved. For example, Law 200 states, if a man knock out the tooth of a man of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth. But Law 201 points out that if he knock out the tooth of a common man, he shall pay 1/3 manner of silver. So how should we interpret this? Is the payment of an amount of money by a wealthy man less of a punishment than losing a tooth, and therefore indicative of one rule for the rich and one for the poor? Or do the laws genuinely attempt to help the common man by offering him financial compensation for the attack on his person by the gentleman? Presumably, the 1/3 manner of silver would be a lot more useful to the common man than a nobleman's tooth. Hammurabi's laws also provide us with an intriguing window into evolving attitudes about gender relations in the 2nd millennium BCE. Despite the fact that, as we saw last time, women in Mesopotamian society did have the opportunity to play various public roles, scribes and priestesses, for example, in general, Mesopotamia was a patriarchal society that vested public authority in men. Hammurabi's laws do explicitly recognize men as heads of their households. The men are entrusted to make all major decisions concerning the roles and duties of individual members of the household, the arrangements of marriages, and the right to sell wives and children into slavery to pay off debts. And some of the laws do seem particularly harsh on women and demonstrate that a gender double standard was already in place. Women could be drowned for adultery, for example, but it was perfectly acceptable for married men to have sexual relations with concubines and slaves. One example of the extraordinary long-term influence of Hammurabi's code is the promulgation of laws stating that women were expected to cover their heads and bodies in public. This cultural practice thus first emerged in Mesopotamia and was later adopted by other cultures, including that of Islam, thousands of years later. It remains a practice of considerable debate around the world even today. Here is one such law, Law 133. If his wife go out of her house and she do not protect her body, and she enter into another house, because the woman did not protect her body and entered into another house, they shall convict that woman and they shall throw her into the river. But other laws do seem to offer genuine protection for women. Law 127 states that men could be punished for making false accusations against women. Law 128 reminds men that they need to draw up a legal contract with a woman before she would become his wife. Law 130 states that the rape of a virgin was punishable by death. Law 134, that men were expected to provide sufficient food for their wives. And Law 209 points out that any man striking a pregnant woman and causing a miscarriage would have to pay a financial penalty. But it is difficult to know how to interpret the very next law, Law 210, which states that if a woman is struck such a blow by a man that she dies, the state will put the daughter of the assailant to death. The codification of laws was not the only extraordinary contribution King Hammurabi made to world history. During his reign, the Babylonians also made great advances in mathematics, and 1,000 years later, the classical Greeks were tremendously impressed by Babylonian achievements in geometry. Babylonian religious beliefs, probably expressing pre-existing Sumerian views, explicitly stated that immortality is exclusively reserved for the gods. This is a crucial point, I think. There was no concept of an afterlife as a reward for good behavior in Sumerian or Babylonian belief systems, a view that probably contributed to a pervasive sense of futility and pessimism that seems to characterize Mesopotamian society and ideology more broadly. Public religion was dominated by numerous priesthoods. There were more than 30 different categories of priests and priestesses, and one of their functions was to interpret events in the natural and human world, each of which was viewed as an omen. Dreams were also viewed as omens, although how these were actually interpreted by some Babylonian Sigmund Freud is a mystery. Overall, the efforts by Hammurabi and his successors to administer the large imperial state of Babylonia were successful. Further evidence that by getting better at their jobs, rulers and elites facilitated the expansion of early agrarian civilizations. But the downside of that success was that Mesopotamia became even more attractive to outsiders. After a couple of centuries of effective rule, the Babylonians crumbled in the face of invasions by a new group of militarized invaders, the Hittites, who in 1595 BCE came sweeping from the north down the great river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, valleys that acted as virtual highways into the Mesopotamian heartland. The Hittites spoke the oldest known example of a family of languages that were destined to become extraordinarily successful, the Indo-European languages. Indo-European is defined as a family of languages issuing from a common language which have become differentiated by gradual separation. A family that is, by the way, at least 4,000 years old. It is this differentiation through separation that makes the Indo-European languages so important for historians, since the various branches of the family can be located over great geographical areas stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia, and can all be traced back to an original prototype. Indo-European languages were destined to become the largest and most widely diffused linguistic family in the world. Their spread often came at the expense of other non-Indo-European languages, which had simply obliterated in its relentless diffusion over 4 millennia. The origins of the original Indo-European speakers can be traced back to the Caucasus region in Inner Eurasia, somewhere between the Black and Caspian Seas. Scholars assume that the original IE languages were spoken by pastoral nomads from that region, who eventually spread out in a series of migrations across vast regions of Eurasia, taking their language with them. Indo-European languages are classified into various branches: Aryan or Indo-Iranian, Thraco-Phrygian, Illyrian, Venetic, Anatolian, Hellenic, Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Tocharian, and Albanian. Today, the Indo-European family includes an estimated 443 different languages and dialects spoken by roughly 50% of the people on the planet. Contemporary languages in this superfamily include English, French, German, Hindi, Persian, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish, each with more than 100 million native speakers, as well as numerous smaller regional or minority languages. So it was Indo-European speaking migrants called Hittites, whose ancestors most probably came from the Caucasus region, who eventually entered Mesopotamia from what is today Turkey sometime around 1595 BCE, and who used their innovative military technologies to carve out a substantial empire. At its peak, in the 14th century BCE, the Hittite Empire included much of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. Despite the fact that they were clearly successful conquerors, the Hittites, like the Elamites, were in turn heavily influenced by the complex and sophisticated cultural and social innovations that the Sumerians had created over the preceding 2,000 years. That is, and this is another very common process in world history, although the Hittites conquered the Mesopotamians, it was Mesopotamian culture that conquered the invaders. One example of this, the Hittite political and social structure was closely based on Mesopotamian models, particularly the idea of a divine or at least semi-divine king. And like the Sumerian elites before them, Hittite nobles owned large estates and used the agricultural resources from these to maintain strong military forces that would provide support for the king when required. The Hittites also adopted the sophisticated Sumerian cuneiform script to write down their spoken Indo-European language, and they adopted Hammurabi's law code. The key reasons for Hittite military dominance were the use of the chariot, the first time this war machine had been seen in world history, and also their skill as iron workers. The Hittites are the first people known to have manufactured and used iron weapons and tools, a metallurgical revolution that marks the crossing of another threshold of complexity by our species. With their success, Western Eurasia moved out of the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age sometime around 1300 BCE, as Hittite iron metallurgy spread throughout Anatolia and Mesopotamia. This rapid diffusion was partly because iron ore deposits are relatively abundant and much cheaper than copper and tin, the ingredients of bronze. Also, of course, iron is much stronger than bronze. It's easy to take for granted the availability of iron ore for human use and to assume perhaps that its availability near Earth's surface is just an inherent feature of our planet. It's true that Earth has no shortage of iron because the Earth and our solar system was formed out of the remnants of a supernova, and there was plenty of iron in the complex array of elements that made up the early Earth. But due to the process of differentiation that occurred within our planet as it formed, essentially the liquefaction of much of the planet because of extreme heat, much of the iron sank to the core of our planet where it resides today, helping to create the magnetic field that surrounds the Earth and helps protect it from solar radiation. So the fact that so much iron ore was still available near the planet's surface for early human metallurgists to work with is something of a mystery. Astronomers now propose that this iron, along with other valuable metals such as gold and tungsten, was brought to the planet during a late heavy bombardment of mineral-rich asteroids that pummeled the Earth and the other terrestrial planets around 3.9 billion years ago. Had it not been for this bombardment, humans would not have had iron ore to work with, and we might still be stuck in the Bronze Age. Despite their sophisticated military innovations and their adoption of many Mesopotamian administrative techniques, the Hittites rarely had a unified political structure, and the kings often fought with their nobles, which effectively limited the power of the monarchy. But when they did present a unified front, their powerful army was able to conquer much of West Asia in a series of expansionary campaigns. A number of bloody battles with the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II in Palestine resulted in stalemate and eventually a peace treaty. But soon after this, sometime around 1200 BCE, mysterious and dramatic changes began to occur throughout much of Southwest Asia. The cause, once again, may have been climate change. Climate data shows that a severe drought in the eastern Mediterranean region came to a climax just around that time, at the end of a significant warming period. The deteriorating climate and potential subsistence crisis it engendered forced major population movements amongst many different peoples of the region. Suddenly people were on the move everywhere. Libyans, Israelites, Arameans, Phrygians, and a mysterious group known simply as the Sea People. These movements, essentially forced and often violent migrations, were so severe and disruptive that this chaotic period is described by historians as a dark age. The Sea Peoples get their name from a French Egyptologist who used the phrase peoples of the sea in 1895 in translating an Egyptian relief from the reign of Ramesses III. Historians today see them as a group of highly militarized sea raiders from somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean who caused chaos in many of the settled states of the region around the end of the Bronze Ages. Some scholars even link this Dark Age chaos with the Trojan War. The chaotic migrations and invasions of the period meant that many organized sedentary ruling elites were displaced and many states weakened, including in Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, and the Hittite hegemony in Mesopotamia. Is there a lesson in here for our future? Will climate change or political rest in the 21st century cause similar disruptions, forcing millions to migrate into other regions of the world to survive? If so, the world may see dramatic shifts in the locus and balance of power among nations. The Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BCE, presenting an opportunity for another ambitious people. The next chapter in the history of civilization in Southwest Asia was written by the Assyrians, a Semitic people who, during the 19th century BCE, had created their own small but militarily powerful state in the upper Tigris River Valley. The Assyrians used their military, which, like that of the Hittites, was based on the devastating effectiveness of horse-drawn chariots, to gradually extend their domain until they had created their own substantial empire. The first cities and states that had appeared in the Sumerian Delta almost 2,000 years before now found themselves once again acting as small cogs in an enormous imperial machine that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. As evidence of this expansion, the Assyrian conquest of the kingdom of Israel is featured prominently in the Hebrew Bible. By the 8th century, the Assyrians were, along with the Egyptians, one of the two great powers of Western Afro-Eurasia. The great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE, expanded on Hammurabi's claim by naming himself King of the Universe, an honorific he justified by presiding over a realm that included all of Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, parts of Anatolia, and most of Egypt. Assyrian success was built on a powerful and intimidating army in which troops were organized into standardized units under the command of professional officers. And these officers were appointed to their commands because of their skill and bravery rather than the nobility of their birth. The Assyrians used chariots brilliantly, placing archers on them so they became fast-moving firing platforms. Can you imagine wave after wave of superbly handled Assyrian chariots sweeping towards your forces with a combination of high speed and devastating firepower? Their opponents were so unnerved by these attacks that they were left in disarray, making them easy prey for the Assyrian infantry forces that followed. Once the military had done its work, defeated peoples in their cities and states were ruthlessly ruled through strong, centralized bureaucratic administration. And the Assyrians could indeed be ruthless. For example, they used the mass deportation of prisoners, including after the conquest of Israel, tens of thousands of Israelites, to destroy the nationalistic attachment of peoples to particular lands. But despite their military prowess, like the Elamites, like the Hittites before them, the Assyrians were in turn captivated by sophisticated Mesopotamian cultural inventions, including Hammurabi's laws and Sumer's superb literature, copies of which they collected into huge state libraries in the royal palaces. In fact, it was Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's palace library that preserved much of the Sumerian literature that has survived to the present day, including copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Ashurbanipal's successors could not sustain an empire as large as the one that he had controlled, however, because despite the precedents established by Sargon and by Hammurabi in maintaining smaller empires, political leaders had still not learned the necessary techniques for sustaining much larger imperial structures. Only with the Persians in the following century would leaders learn how to both build and maintain a truly giant empire. Given their ruthless tactics, it's hardly surprising that Assyrian rule was extremely unpopular and rebellions were almost constant. During the 7th century BCE, these revolts, along with internal disunity, significantly weakened the Assyrians. In the year 612, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh was destroyed by Medes and the Chaldeans, and the Assyrian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, crumbled quickly. In the aftermath, the city-state of Babylon, one of the original dozen cities of Sumer, enjoyed a final glorious half-century of independence under King Nebuchadnezzar between 605 and 562 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar turned Babylon into one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its massive walls were purportedly wide enough to turn a chariot around on. The city covered more than 2,000 acres and featured 1,179 different temples, many decorated with gold facing and with statues. And the king's famous hanging gardens spilled from terraces built one above the other behind the city's walls. The story goes that one of the king's wives longed to see the flowering shrubs of her original mountain homeland. So Nebuchadnezzar had the terraces of mud brick built and planted them with shrubs and trees. The gardens, which have symbolized and indeed immortalized the city's luxuriousness ever since, must have been an extraordinary feat of engineering, not least because the towering garden would have had no natural source of irrigation in this arid Mesopotamian environment. To water it, some extraordinary hydrological method of pumping water upwards from the Euphrates must have been invented, perhaps using some sort of a water screw, but we just don't know. Nor can we really be certain that the gardens actually existed, although there are numerous references to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in many later ancient sources. No archaeological evidence has ever been found, nor any textual references to them from the period of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. The oldest reference we have actually to the gardens comes from an early 3rd century BCE historian, Berosus, who was quoted thus by the later Jewish historian, Josephus. In this palace, Nebuchadnezzar erected very high walks supported by stone pillars, and by planting what was called a pensile paradise and replenishing it with all sorts of trees, he rendered the prospect an exact resemblance of a mountainous country. This he did to gratify his queen because she had been brought up in Media and was fond of a mountainous situation. If this Green Mountain did actually exist, this recreation of the luxurious mountains of northeastern Iran in the Sumerian desert, it was a fitting testament to the wealth and prowess of the last great autonomous Mesopotamian ruler. Nebuchadnezzar's 43-year reign marked the end of Mesopotamian self-rule forever. After his death in 562 BCE, the kingdom, and indeed all of Mesopotamia, was reduced to playing a small role in a series of much larger agrarian civilizations. These civilizations were destined to be ruled by extraordinarily powerful rulers who mastered the techniques of managing huge populations and vast trans-regional empires. But the methods worked out in Mesopotamia of building and managing cities and states and organizing their people into productive social structures deeply influenced all subsequent Afro-Eurasian civilizations. It's not that later civilizations became carbon copies of Mesopotamia, but they adopted and adapted the Mesopotamian template selectively to suit their own needs and their own environments, using collective learning as only our species can to build on the knowledge and examples of those who came before in order to achieve new things. Mesopotamian technological, social, political, and cultural innovations had a profound impact on the peoples and civilizations of Afro-Eurasia that succeeded them. Among the important lessons that Mesopotamian civilization had to teach the world, and frankly is still teaching us today, is one that many subsequent civilizations overlooked. The environment almost always has to have the last word. From the beginning of its history, the delta region of Sumer was forced to deal with declining agricultural productivity from the increasing salinity of the soil. Agriculture was only possible in this arid environment because of the widespread application of irrigation. But the inevitable evaporation that occurs with irrigation agriculture causes salts to rise to the surface, eventually rendering the farmland useless. Irrigation-induced salinization has been a problem throughout history and remains so today in many global farming regions that rely on irrigation. Environmental historians can deduce the increasing salinization of Sumerian soil by measuring declining proportions of wheat harvests, because wheat is more susceptible to salinization than barley. Around 3500 BCE, 50% of the grain crop in Sumer was wheat. But over the millennium that followed, salinization took its toll, and by 2500 BCE, wheat accounted for only 15% of the grain crop, as salinized soils were converted to barley instead. Wheat was not the only plant affected, however. Total crop yields fell by 40% between 24 and 2100 BCE, and by 1700, even barley could no longer be grown in Samaria, leading to an additional 66% decline in crop yields. The problem of long-term sustainability, of not overexploiting the environment that keeps us alive through agriculture, has haunted complex societies for more than 4,000 years. It continues to haunt us just as profoundly today as we deal not only with issues related to irrigation and salinization, but also with a rapidly warming climate that has the potential to be far more destructive on our own civilization than anything we find evidence of in the ancient past.